Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Jun-sok, professor of economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Professor Yang, thank you for coming on today.
Happy to be here.
Now we have the Korean government coming out with a third extra budget for the first time in about half a century. So what kind of effect do you think this extra spending will have, and what concerns might there be?
Okay, well, if you look at, first of all, the amount of the supplementary budget, and since it's all being spent this year, let's look at the total first, second, and third supplementary budget together. That's more than 50 trillion won. This is the highest supplementary budget that there has ever been, and not only with the absolute amount, but also in proportion to Korea's GDP. This is going to be about 3% of Korea's GDP. This compares to supplementary budget we had in 2009 after the global financial crisis, which was 2.36% of Korea's GDP, and after the 97 global Asian financial crisis, that in 1998, the supplementary budget was about 2.33% of Korean GDP. So both in the absolute amount and in the proportion, the three supplementary budgets that we're having this year will be the largest that Korea has ever seen. But still, this is less than what other countries are spending. For example, the United States, they don't call it a supplementary budget, but their Congress allowed $3 trillion in additional spending. That's about 13% of U.S. GDP. So even though this is a large amount for Korea, it's not particularly large compared to some of the other countries' increased budgets. As to the effect, well, we are just talking about the budget, but they're going to spend most of this budget on the economic plan that the Moon administration announced on Monday. That includes emergency measures to deal with the negative shock from the coronavirus, as well as the so-called Digital New Deal and the Green New Deal. I think their short-term budgeting plans, the ones that are dealing with the negative shock from coronavirus, I think they're necessary. They're relatively well thought out. But for the Digital New Deal and the Green New Deal components, we're seeing a lot of the type of policies that we've seen before in previous administrations. The effectiveness of these policies have been mixed. For example, allowing new venture capital, providing more funds to certain types of companies, providing investment incentives, and so on. Those have had mixed results in the past, so I'm a bit more worried about the Digital New Deal and the Green New Deal component. And then finally, the additional supplementary budget will probably increase Korea's debt-GDP ratio to about 43-44% of the GDP. That, I think, Korea's economy can handle right now. But we will continue to have a supplementary budget probably next year. And because of the demographic changes in Korea, we will probably continue to have a lot of budget deficits in the years in the future. So we really do need to prepare to slow down, to find out ways to slow down the increases in the debt-GDP ratio. But that's a project for the future rather than project for now.
Well, now elsewhere, Korea is reopening its case at the WTO against Japan's export restrictions. This, of course, is an issue related to semiconductors and Japan's restriction on key materials related to their manufacturing. So what does the reopening of this case mean to Korean companies?
Okay, well, in terms of production, it probably doesn't mean very much. Korea has been living with Japan's export restrictions, and we've done a fairly good job in adjusting to it. Korea has found alternate sources for these chemicals, and they've learned how to deal with perhaps using less pure chemicals to produce semiconductors, and developing domestic sources as well. So in terms of production, I don't think it's going to affect Korean businesses all that much. Where it will make a difference maybe is the diplomatic front, because now Korea has leverage to try to get Japan to drop the export restriction, or at the very least least, do not expand the export restrictions into other areas, other chemicals or areas outside semiconductors. Korea is still very vulnerable in some industries to Japan's export restrictions. So this WTO case can serve as a leverage to try to stop that. Also, it is not entirely clear whether Japan can win the case in the WTO. And the reason that Japan has put the export restrictions in place in the first place is try to get Korea to not sell off the assets that Korean government, Korean courts had confiscated in order to pay compensations for workers who were forced to work in Japanese steel mills during the Japanese colonialization of Korea. That process right now is suspended. It isn't moving forward. So I think this will serve as a tool, a leverage to stop Japan from expanding the export restrictions. It will not affect the Korean production all that much. And also, it'll take about a year or two at the very least to get this case through the WTO. So in one sense, we're letting this problem sort of run on. Don't let it get serious. Just leave it at the point we're at right now so that the problem doesn't get worse and Korea can still import needed goods from Japan without worrying about further export restrictions.
All right, and we're almost out of time, though, Professor Young, but take us through the global markets. The rallies continue in Wall Street and here in Korea.
Yeah, it's almost mysterious how well the stock markets are doing, even though we're getting a lot of bad news. We are learning more and more that coronavirus will last until at least 2021, and the United States especially are dealing with riots over the death of George Floyd, a black man who was killed during police arrest, and the U.S.-China trade war seems to be getting worse, but these are not reflected in the stock markets all that much. That may be because the government and central banks of these countries are taking a lot of risks out of the stock market, and also maybe because the stock investors are irrationally exuberant, but we'll have to see whether this trend continues.
All right, Professor Young, thanks so much for your insights. We appreciate it, as always.
Thank you.